Welcome back to this second hour. We're continuing our conversation with Christopher Knight, and obviously talking about the work that he has done together with Alan Butler as well on Who Built the Moon, Civilisation One, and Before the Pyramids as well. This is a very, very interesting discussion that we're having here. And I'd like to ask you a little bit more here, Chris, about going back to the DNA aspect of the work that you've been contemplating. And if you think that there could be hidden clues, I guess, lying in dormant maybe in the non-coding DNA or so-called junk DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Some research have speculated that there was a kind of a rush, if you will, in terms of the Human Genome Project led by Craig Venter that you mentioned before, that it was kind of sort of a rush to decode this before the millennium shift, and people have speculated why and so forth as well. But do you think that there could be a clue hidden in the so-called junk DNA?
It seems extremely likely, and more importantly, leading physicists like Paul Davies are suggesting that it is quite possible that there could be a message in there. Obviously, he's prepared to take a risk with with his academic standing, but he has a tremendous standing in suggesting that, because the immediate question is, who's the message from? But it has all the hallmarks of being a message with an intended recipient across billions of years. To call it junk, you don't put junk into Fort Knox. You protect your gold because it's valuable. Everything else within the DNA was allowed to change and modify to allow for the evolution of life on Earth. But this bit is ready at a point in time, perhaps, to communicate to the life form that you've created, i.e. humans, which is why, as you pointed out, that the moon is only in this position right now, in astronomical terms right now. So the message is, pay attention. Now, various physicists, including Paul Davies, have said, if I was wanting to give a message over huge periods of time, whether it be from God or from an alien or from any other source, I'd make it very, very big in your backyard so you couldn't miss it, or I'd make it very, very small so you had to really look to find it. And what I'm suggesting is that it's both those things. We look at the moon and the sun and that little miracle, which is the starter for 10, of the perfect fit of them both being 1/366th part of the sky, as it happens.
Yeah.
That they overlap each other to create a perfect eclipse. But there's much, much more to it than that. That's only the starter to make us pay attention. And then when this discussion takes place, and people hopefully will finally start to look at what we've got here and say that cannot be coincidence. And if that was a message, what would it be trying to point us to? And then you look to DNA packets that come in 1 million units, and you apply the screen that's given to us by the numerical values that are clearly there in the sky. It's a little bit like if a modern car was dug up in 1 million years' time, you'd be able to deduce the metric system. You could see that there was a standardized method of measurement. That is what has happened with the Earth, Moon, and Sun, and in terms of mass, speed, orbital distance, physical size, everything. It's not just the one thing. It starts with the one. So if we can start to say, hey, that just could be a message, what could it try and be pointing us towards? And any intelligent person would immediately think, well, what's this junk stuff in DNA about that's been suggested? That's a message. If we apply one to the other, that may be the key to unlock it.
Very interesting. There was two Russian scientists that kind of did a paper on some of the anomalies, I guess, some of the findings in terms of the moon as well.
Yes.
Did this serve as kind of the inspiration for the beginning of your book, Chris?
No. We certainly came across their work because the Soviet Academy of Sciences got a bit upset with them because they back in the 70s, I think they were saying.
I think it was 70s, yes.
Yeah, I think they were saying the moon is artificial. But this is the time, of course, when the Americans had just landed on the moon and the Russians were sending spacecraft to the moon. And they used standard calculations to land objects on the moon. But unlike everything else that we know about in the universe, the moon is not denser in the middle and lighter at the outside. It's lighter in the middle and denser at the outside. It has things called mass cons around it, concentrations of mass. And therefore they kept crashing into the moon or going across it. They'd go up and down because of the changes in gravity, if you like. It's not logical. And as one guy, a friend of mine from NASA said, when they first hit the moon with drop the takeoff part of the vehicle back into the moon, and they'd put sounding equipment out, he said it wibbled wobbled like it was on gas struts. He said the whole thing just moved and rang like a bell. So there are a number of people, Russians and Americans, that have said it, that the moon is artificial. And like anybody else, I'd have thought, well, it's crazy. But we came to it only because we realized that the megalithic yard and that the megalithic system of measurement, which was incredibly accurate, was geodetic and worked beautifully on the Earth. Just for sort of thoroughness, because that's the sort of thing we do, we checked into its other properties, including its volumes, and then we found connections with the pound and the pint and the meter and so forth. But we applied it to the sun and the moon, and we found they are perfect. There are 100 megalithic degrees around the circumference of the moon, as exactly as you could ever wish to measure it, in the same way that 366 on the Earth, and there are 40,000 on the sun. And then other things fell out. So it was like, what is going on? So Alan and I started to look closer at the moon, because we hadn't had any particular interest in the moon before, because we thought, well, if the sun and the moon and the Earth are all completely integer in every respect, we've got to think that the sun was there first. Let's assume that the Earth, as is said, was there second, and that the moon was created shortly after the Earth. Therefore, it's the moon that, because you could find two integers with two objects, but not with three. So the new boy on the block is the moon. So we started to look into what's known about it. And then we came across these Soviet guys and others, and we realized there's a big problem. I mean, as one NASA scientist said, the best explanation for the moon is that it's observational error. It can't be there. You know, it breaks all the rules.
How about the age of the rocks? A study apparently that was performed on some of the samples brought back.
Yeah.
You know, what was up with that? 5.3 billion years, and then it's older than other things.
It's older than any rock on Earth, other than we know.
Yeah.
We know what it's made of. It's made of Earth rock. It basically where the Pacific is now is where it was scooped up from and taken, would you believe? But because it's been there's no geological activity there, the Earth has been churned up largely because of the moon going round. In the early days, it was a very close orbit, and it just plowed the Earth up and mixed everything up and allowed all the nutrients out and kept the angle of tilt and everything exactly right. So water on most of the Earth remains in liquid form, which is an unbelievable miracle. And all the minerals from the land that was being plowed effectively by the moon were leached into this water and created this perfect soup for life. But the moon, apart from being bombarded with passing objects, has been fixed in time. So its rock is as old as the Earth was at the point of departure, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So it's very ancient, and there's no doubting at all its date. What is a doubt is how the hell it came to be there, because there's no moon we know of any other planet that behaves like it's more like a twin planetary system, really, because it's so big in relation to.
That's right. There's nothing else as far as they've found yet in on other planets. The ratio.
Pluto has, but that well, for a start, Pluto's not counted as a planet anymore, but that's really a binary planet. It's every other moon in the solar system and beyond, because we know a little bit about other solar systems now, is very much smaller, and there is nowhere we know of that has the stability. The moon is like the mother hen; it's like an incubator. It just keeps the temperature perfect. It keeps the tilt exactly as it needs to do to give us seasons. So we've got growing seasons. It forms a miracle, and if it hadn't done everything it has done since over the last 4.5 billion years or so, we would not be here, and it's on a knife edge. And of course, there are people that go back further to say that why is basic physics as it is. If hydrogen was slightly different, we couldn't exist, and the rules of everything are so finely balanced in our favour. But the Earth itself is a miracle beyond all belief. Given all the stars and planets that exist in the whole universe, the chances of there being one Earth are virtually nil. But we're here.
That's right. And so we're looking at the moon as obviously as an intricate part of the system in order to make life possible, creating of the tides to kind of a shield of sorts, actually capturing many of the bodies that would hit us otherwise that is out there as well.
Well, no, really, Jupiter and to some extent Saturn are catchers. They're beautifully positioned to catch the debris for us. Occasionally they slip, but Schumacher-Levy 9, that hit Jupiter and created fireballs bigger than the planet Earth, something like that hit us. It's good night.
That's
goodbye.
Right. What's your take, by the way, on the asteroid belt then between Mars and Jupiter? Some people speculate that there might have been a planet there and so forth, and Tom and Flandern speculate in the ratios again, that logically there should have been a planetary body in that position. What do you think about that?
I take that as you give it. I'm a synthesizer of information, and I'm with no scientific training whatsoever. But I'm very good at manipulating information and making sort of sense of it. But I'm not in a position to say that's right or wrong. There is clearly a balance in the solar system, and that's probably correct. But what matters is the Earth-Moon-Sun relationship and the way the planets are placed to help us, to be catchers, as you point out. But it's the Earth-Moon-Sun relationship that's particularly special. And then our situation in the whole universe, which appears to be increasingly, scientists are seeing it as something a little bit unusual. So I've turned from being a totally pragmatic person
right.
to being one that has to be prepared to think the unthinkable.
Yeah.
And really, we do get conditioned these days. The term science has been hijacked by this group of people called scientists, because the term scientist is very, very modern. It's very recent. It just means someone that uses the principles of science, but unfortunately, many of them don't. They're very unscientific because they seek out evidence that supports what they already believe.
That's right.
There's some hugely honourable exceptions to that, of course. Many great scientists, of course, there are, but there's a whole category of what I call technologist scientists. They're just lower order people who don't really understand, the Richard Feynmans of this world, the people with the bigger viewpoint that could understand context, and are frightened to ask questions that have got potentially intimidating answers.
Absolutely. I think there's a few interesting facts more about the moon I'd like to ask you about, and your take on that. If it is indeed hollow, then that some of the tests suggest that it was ringing like a bell and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think then that means that something is inside of the moon? There's even people who speculated because of the nature of the dark side, or we just one side turned towards us, that there is something on the backside. What do you think about that, Chris?
Well, people like Richard Hoagland were saying that to me years ago when I first sort of arrived on the scene with the Hiram Key, which was a fairly straight-laced book. But I think that's hugely unlikely. Nothing's impossible, of course, but the moon is, I think, not so much hollow inside as not especially dense, which is, the center of the Earth obviously is massively dense. And therefore you can sort of sense that how it may have been made from removing matter from the Earth, rather than in the coalescing of natural materials, which is the way most planetary objects, whether they become captive moons or planets themselves or whatever, these are all nice terms, but it is, as I understand it, just stardust that's dead stars that's coalescing into spherical objects, and then the natural mass of the weight of the whole thing increases the pressure towards the center. Something different happened with the moon, and that might be due to the way it was created from the Earth, a bit like the biblical Adam's rib. It's sort of taken from the original.
Why do you think that it is that we, or maybe they in this case, haven't been back to the moon? That's always a question that has intrigued me, and the fact that they allegedly made it there in '69, and then we have struggled since, basically, to go back or to find the interest or whatever the reason is. What do you think?
Well, I've been shown photographs of objects that are claimed to be on the moon. And of course, there are rumors that we've been told, get off this private property. But I think that's all incredibly unlikely. I think it's probably a little more prosaic than that. I think when Kennedy said at the beginning of the 60s, we go to the moon, it was part of this intellectual muscle race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And they got there in more by good luck than design, I think, in 1969. Having got there wasn't any commercial advantage in it. There wasn't any military advantage in it. They had demonstrated they could do it. The Russians sort of gave up on it then because they didn't see any big deal in doing it anyway. And so it just cost too much. There is an awful lot of very valuable material on the moon in terms of fuel, but the cost of recovery is too great. So I think it was a political point that was made once. It's probably as simple as that.
Very interesting. But what do you make then, as a Mason, in some of the interesting ideas that there was a flag of the Scottish Rite taken up to the moon, and many of the astronauts were also Masons. Is this? Can we tie this in with something that you mentioned before, that at the upper echelons of Masonry, they do know, if you know what I mean, what they're doing and having a different agenda, if you will?
Well, some of them were Freemasons. I can't remember which offhand now, but and it's not impossible that they took a Scottish Rite flag with them at all. But since I've been interviewed on television and radio programs, mainly in the States, since the Hiram Key came out in 1996, I've said of Freemasonry, it's harmless. It's a historical artifact that served its purpose, in my view. In the founding of the United States of America was a Masonic experiment, and that was the pinnacle of its achievement. And after that, it's just become a bit of a museum piece, and it's harmless, and there's no secret agenda, and there are no secrets, and all these people that accuse Freemasonry of being of having a secret agenda are deluded. I've now had to change my mind and confess I was wrong. There clearly is a massive agenda driven by people at the highest level, and in fact so high they're just beyond Freemasonry. It would appear that there's a conduit into the top from somewhere else.
But you're saying it would be erroneous to only identify these men as being Masons. Maybe there's something else there as well. Is that what you're saying?
No. What I'm saying is there is an organization that is less visible than the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry that tells Scottish Rite of Freemasonry what to do and what to think. So it's the public arm of something else, if you see what I mean. There's and there is an agenda which appears to be benign. It's not to seize power, but it is immensely powerful, and I think they see it as the fulfillment of the 3,000-year mission from the time of Solomon to create a city and a land that's worthy of God ruling over the earth again. And they're using the old ways secretly to do that. And it's no secret, of course, that the number of the founding fathers that were Freemasons. But it's the fact it's still happening today that I find most astounding, and that's what's covered in our more recent book, Before the Pyramids, which started out as a very down-to-earth book, pointing out quite clearly the evidence that the theories put forward in Civilisation One were correct, because we found the megalithic structures that were exactly as we described that they would need to be, which we found years afterwards. But then we found that the pyramids were actually designed at one of these sites in England, and that the pyramids are a copy of a structure that's 1,000 years older, which is still here in England. But it was probably built by Egyptians. So I'm not, we're not trying to say England built the pyramids, but the mathematics is bulletproof. But the people that run Washington, D.C. know all about this, because they have built, they did originally build Washington at the beginning of the 19th century, using these ancient measures with such precision for everything. Not some things, everything.
Yeah.
And it's so checkable and testable. But the really scary bit was when we realized that the Pentagon is Stonehenge rebuilt.
Really?
And the man that designed it was President of the United States of America at the time, and just about to take his country into the Second World War. And they had to build the Pentagon quickly, and they were building it somewhere else. And he said, no, I don't want it there, I want it here. And I want the middle of it here, and I want it looking like this. And he actually gave the design to the architects, against advice from the army and from all and sundry. But he said, I'm the boss, I'll tell you what to do. And he was a 33rd degree Freemason. And he's built it following the instructions that are in the 32nd and the 33rd degree of Freemasonry, which is about defense of the realm. And the number of megalithic seconds of arc between the Capitol building, the center of the Capitol building, the center of the Pentagon, which face each other, that's a curious angle, to the epicenter of Washington, D.C., which is a hidden chamber in the myth. It sounds so fanciful, but it's a hidden chamber in the President's Park, just south of the White House, with the north-south line going through it to the Jefferson Memorial, and which he identified as being the zero line of longitude, or he intended it to be, but it's still Greenwich. But that was the intention. And there are 33 megalithic seconds of arc between those three centres, one for each of the degrees of the 33rd degree on the Scottish Rite. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. The whole building was structured 25 times the size of Stonehenge, but every corner, every wall follows the patterning. They understood it, exactly what they're doing. Every junction, every monument at intersections, everything about the structure was originally designed to follow to the millimeter using these ancient measurements. They don't use feet, they don't use yards, they don't use meters, they don't use anything other than these megalithic units, megalithic yards and seconds of arc.
So you're saying that Franklin D. Roosevelt is behind it, and not George Bergström. He is believed to be a Norwegian, I think, of Norwegian ancestry, that he had nothing to do with it? Or
he had nothing to do. He may have been part of the Scottish Rite, 33rd degree. Who knows? But it's a known fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a bit of an amateur architect himself anyway, reasonably accomplished. But for him, on such an important thing, when the army said, there isn't time, we can't move it, and he insisted to be put in a place that was called Hell's Bottom. It was just an absolute horrible place where they had to drain riverbank and move marshes, and it had to be built at some speed because they knew they were going to war. But it had to be in that exact position to have this juxtaposition with this chamber and the center of the capital. And it had to be at that angle, and it had to have the 5 walls, because that's what's dictated in the Scottish Rite, and the walls within the walls, and the sizes of them had to be exactly as they are, because they are the megalithic dimensions that we find in the 6,000-year-old henges across here in Europe. And the chances of all these things being done in 1941 by accident are non-existent. And the words spoken in the 32nd and 33rd degrees describe exactly what happened. They were building this structure to win the war that was going to turn the world into their oyster, because they were building the New Jerusalem. The whole idea of Washington, D.C. is to build the New Jerusalem, the city that is fit for Yahweh to rule the earth. Because these people were originally Jewish priesthood, according to the rituals of Freemasonry. They describe how they when the direct destruction of the temple took place in 70 AD, when Titus and the Roman troops destroyed it and they lost the war. 1.3 million Jews lay dead. The priests escaped to Europe, and this is all explained in Masonic ritual, which at one time I would have thought was a fanciful story, but it actually totally fits. And there, as they moved to northern France, they met the Normans, the Norse people, who had come down from Scandinavia, who had got knowledge of the original structures that were built, because they were the builders. And they realized that they needed to work together. And for the last 1,000 years, they have been working together.
So that was, sorry to interrupt, but that was interesting then that they chose to, at least officially, have the sign of the Pentagon attributed to a Norwegian ancestor right there.
Yes, there is a very neat tidying up there. That's true.
Yeah. So, okay, well, this opens up a can of worms right here, obviously.
Yes.
Why do this before war? Why do they need this? And how is this helping along in their agenda to build a building?
I said to you earlier that Alan and I view our role as initiators of important questions, not necessarily giving the answers.
Right.
But obviously we have to try and make sense of things as we go with candidate answers. And I think that there is, for want of a better word, superstition, I might call it superstition, within these people's minds. They're immensely rich, immensely powerful, that they need to fulfill this ancient prophecy, such as described in all the rituals of Freemasonry, the old rituals that weren't changed willy-nilly in the 1800s by Americans for general consumption. The original ones describe this.
Yeah.
And if they really believe that, as George Washington and his co-founders of the new state of the United States of America believe that their country, and most particularly their new capital, the Washington District of Columbia, was going to be the New Jerusalem, because they tried to, after the Norman invasion of England, they tried to build it in England, but it failed, and they realized they needed to go to a new land where there was no baggage. They could do what they wanted, and so they set out to build it, and the mission was that God would, the creator, the grand geometrician of the universe, as is often referred to in Freemasonry, would return. And this is people that are remembering almost certainly the lost Civilization One, what happened before, and they're trying to recreate that age of wisdom and knowledge, which is a marriage, in my view, between hard science and the philosophical human qualities which seem to have got lost in modern science. They really have lost the human factor. I think it used to have it, and I think they're trying to recreate that. This is my best shot at explaining it. And because this war was going to clearly be another global war, it was the one that was going to put the United States of America into the driving seat. They knew that Stalin's lot across in Russia was still an issue, but they thought this was the time to make it work, and God would come down to earth, the will of God, the goodness, if they used all the right measures and they put everything in the right place, it would become holy enough for them to complete the mission.
Okay, let me run this by you here then, because we have the beginning of the building taking place on September 11th, 1941.
Yeah.
Obviously, exactly 60 years after this, the Flight 77 hits the west side of the Pentagon. We can tie that in later, but I mean, the reason we're given why America entered World War II is because on December 7th, later, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. They knew what they were doing then.
Yeah, there are some funny bits in there. Another awkward one, which almost can't work out and don't like to think about too much. From the center of Washington, D.C., exactly 3 megalithic degrees, that's 366 of the Earth's surface, takes you to the western tower of the Twin Towers, to the millimeter. And you try and link anything else by any means, and nothing else works at all. And of course, it could be a coincidence, but it's a very strange one, especially given the timing. I certainly cannot buy, personally, into the conspiracy theory that the U.S. military or political people were involved in the thing. But it's very odd, and their enemies must know a great deal about their inner workings to have chosen those timings and locations.
I guess what I'm alluding to there as well, obviously, is that they were beginning the building on the Pentagon because they knew they were entering the war.
Oh yes,
but the reason for them to entering the war didn't come until later.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I have to absorb so much information. It's with these things, and I'm mostly involved with archaeology and measurements. But my understanding is that the Americans had put the Japanese into a terrible economic, painted them into a corner where
that's right.
They were going to have to do something.
Forced to do something.
In the same way that the reparations from the First World War put the Germans into an impossible position.
That's right.
So certainly the powers that be at the highest level, and I mean way above the president's level, probably knew all this, that this was happening. And maybe they were quite happy to enter into this war in the same way that the Jews at the time of Christ were looking for the coming war with Michael, the archangel, coming down and leading God's troops to the greatest war that would bring the kingdom of heaven back down to earth. Maybe they were viewing it the same way. It's not impossible. It
is not impossible, absolutely. I do believe I'm on your, the same page as you there, that I believe that this is run by a if you will, of sorts, a theological or a religious conviction, if you will, in that sense. But from my point of view, I obviously cannot understand how this can be perceived as being benign, even though and it makes me question the God Yahweh and the whole idea of Zion and everything, right? How do you see this from your point of view?
Your take on that is entirely understandable. If these people were driving for the war in the same way as that they were at the time of Christ, in fact, Christ was referring to this coming kingdom of heaven. Maybe they are driven by some religious conviction, and I don't think this has got anything to do with the sort of Christians of Texas or anything. It's not. It's something different. And my view, when I said it was benign, was that they wanted to get the city of Washington, because I think they're guilty of having it secret. If they'd have told people, it wouldn't be a problem. But because they did it in total secret, they are somewhat guilty. But I can understand why couldn't tell anybody what they were doing when they originally designed Washington, D.C. But it's happened more recently. The World War II monument that was just built a few years ago, 2006, I think, from memory, stunning, beautiful thing, is again completely, perfectly megalithic using the ancient measures. And checked every city imaginable on Earth, and there's nothing. But Washington D.C. is everything, and continues to be. So when I say it's benign, that wouldn't include them being warmongers. Now, it's possible that they just foresaw the war coming and that they hadn't set out to cause it per se, or at least not deliberately to cause it. That's what I like to think, anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's very, very interesting contemplating these ideas, and we sit here obviously in hindsight looking back at these. Well, obviously some of the inconsistencies when you lay out the timeline, if you will, and how things unfolded obviously at the time. But what do you think about the recent attacks on Zion in 2001, and many things are now actually hinged around September 11th in different through different years throughout history,
Yeah, I mean, this is Alan's area because originally interested in astronomy and then got into astrology, which he doesn't believe in the layman sense, but he's more interested in what people believe it is capable of doing.
Yeah.
In the same way that I spent 20 years studying the Old Testament, not because I was a Jew, but because I just found it extremely interesting. And the passion in their thinking, and they just excite me. In the same way, Alan is interested in astrology, because astronomy and astrology were once the same thing. And in my view, they got corrupted when kings arrived on the scene, particularly in Egypt, who took over power from the priests, and they wanted to use the magic, the voodoo, in their favor. And the astrology started to get all very, what's good signs? When shall I go to battle? Am I going to be rich? Etc. When's a good time to conceive my next child, or whatever? But September 11 is massively important. It's the sun rising in Virgo, is it? And of course, Washington D.C. has got Maryland on one side and Virginia on the other.
That's right. And Pentagon is right, almost smack in the center of that square, by the way, as well.
Yeah, but that female thing, which is at the root of Freemasonry, much to the alarm of many Freemasons, the whole thing is about goddess worship equally with God worship. It's about the polarity of gender in the Godhead. And particularly, it seems, in founding Washington, D.C., they were the Virgin Mary and Maryland. They were acting everything out to make it the most perfect place possible. I mean, even the sort of diamond shape has got female connotations. So there's a huge amount of energy gone into it. And the years I've spent saying that Freemasonry is innocent is true. Freemasonry itself is, because it's just left to go on, and it tends to do good for charities, and they tend to be good people, although there are, as we've seen, unfortunately, this weekend, there are bad people within Freemasonry, but there are bad people within all sorts of organizations.
So what do you believe as a Freemason that, because when I see, if we just tie that, the Norway aspect into this a little bit, then is that I'm viewing this the same way as I viewed Roberto Calvi hanging under the Blackfriars Bridge in the manner he was, that this is someone who's trying to potentially, I'm not saying that this is the case, but get people to eye the Knights Templar as being very evil and the Freemasons, because on the obvious first level surface that you research, everybody will think that Masonry is to blame for this. It's pretty interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and the Knights Templar, the modern Knights Templar, I mean, he was completely unaware of, it would seem, that the Knights Templar still exist in a form, particularly in Scotland. But yes, there is a lot of clever gameplay goes on, like a great game of chess, I think. and there's even a defense mechanism against the sort of work that Alan and I have been involved with, in that the same week our book Before the Pyramids came out, the same story came out with a different man's name on the front, Dan Brown. Unbelievably the same story. But the best way to protect yourself if you think someone's close to outing you is to create a work of fiction in the same week.
You're talking about the Lost Symbol book?
Yes.
Yeah.
You've been reading too much Dan Brown. Yeah. That's just silly.
Yeah.
It's a great defense mechanism.
That's right. It's all fiction, right? It's just...
And that they do fun things, the Scottish Rite. And I was very interested that they funded Rick Strassman's research.
Oh, really now? I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
He was getting nowhere until the Scottish Rite stepped in. Because when I read his book on his trials and tribulations getting this research conducted with the alcohol and tobacco people and drugs people, he was finished. The Scottish Rite turned up and sorted it out and funded him. Now, why would they do that? I think they spotted what he's doing as being connected to this ancient area. Because it's interesting that pilots in the latest fighter jets have these electromagnetic things in their helmets now, and when they're in a particularly intense situation, they press it and their brain powering goes poof. Their concentration and their performance goes up severalfold, which is related. So they understand the technology. And it is the Norwegian connection actually to Scotland and the north of England.
Yes,
and the Norse people taking this
a
knowledge.
Hit, a kind of a hit here as well, or what do you think? Is it retribution for something?
Well, I wouldn't take it that literally, but they are right at the centre of stage in history. In ancient times, obviously, they were one of the same people in Orkney and Faroe
Islands, and yes, exactly.
The Scandinavian coast. I mean,
yeah.
And the formers of the Scottish Freemasonry had huge Norwegian connections. The Murrays.
They potentially. What I've heard from another Mason as well that we had on the program was he was specifically, I think, talking about the Swedish level of Masonry, and he mentioned that it had also preserved something more ancient or whatever it was as well, and maybe that is the connection with some of the knowledge, maybe perhaps that came through the buildings. If you refer to the Scandinavians being the building people, if you will, that they had an interesting connection to Masonry. But go ahead, Chris.
Well, yeah, I think, I mean, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Scotland were all sort of part of a whole, but it's certainly the Norwegian-Scottish connections that are probably most important. My understanding is that Swedish Freemasonry, which is very clear and healthy, is more connected to Germany in recent times. But I've got a file on Swedish Freemasonry which I haven't been through for years, but there are so many different routes to take this back. But it is certainly the people that came down from Scandinavia to Normandy that were the ones that appear to have melded quickly with these Jewish people, understanding that they both had got the same agenda and forming a thing to work together, which has led us to the Washington D.C.
Really, yeah,
ultimate situation.
Do you think that the cultures were similar because at some point they had contact, or they had just similar way of relationship to life and these rituals and knowledge? Or
there is no doubt at all, because you can trace the megalithic structures of United Kingdom and Scandinavia and Spain and France, that whole fringe, through the Mediterranean, through Malta and Crete, and to the Phoenicians, and to the Canaanites as a whole. And of course, the Jewish people were just Canaanites. They were just a lower level tribe. They were, in my view, that's the conclusion I came to, that left when there was a huge drought. It lasted 300 years. They went in different directions, up to the Lebanon and down to Egypt, to the Nile. And then they came back, and that's when they started to post-rationalize. But they went back to as Joshua was carrying his people back after the Exodus, they crossed the Jordan to a place called Gilgal. Gilgal means standing stones. It's a stone circle, circle of standing stones. And they possessed quickly all the high grounds, and the high grounds are where all the megalithic structures are. And in Israel today, there's still all these stone structures that are just the same as you would see in Scotland or in England or many places in northwestern Europe. So there is a continuity that entered into the Canaanite mindset, and in the Old Testament period, when they were writing the Old Testament, circa 700 BC, and they were post-rationalizing the oral traditions, and they were putting together at least 3 different traditions, and they were trying to make them work and understand them. But the most important one of them was the Enochian, in my view, tradition, which was the one that belonged to Jesus Christ, which was the one which had come from this northern tradition, which has been more lately called Celtic, but isn't actually Celtic. So they were from exactly the same tradition. And when they moved back into Europe after the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, there was sort of this meeting again, thousands of years on, of, you've got that tradition too, you understand it, you know what I'm talking about.
Right.
And Venus, the importance of Venus as a godhead and as a physical object that underpins all this science. The observation of Venus is the way you create a megalithic yard, because Venus is the most spooky thing. The way it moves only viewed from the surface of the Earth. The
pentagonal shape of its orbit around the
well,
Earth.
Yeah, and it has a 40-year cycle that's accurate to a second. Before 1950, when atomic clocks were invented, that's how we kept time, the movement of Venus. The Venus has been important in many cultures. The Sumerians, of course, who were in the Tigris-Euphrates area, who were also related because they had the meter and the double cush, as they called it, and the liter and all those things, which came from the pendulum science that was used up in Northern Europe, because they'd been using those same units at least 6,000 years ago, before the Sumerians adopted them. So there was a commonality of movement of science and theology. And these super priests, set in motion according to Freemasonry by Solomon, which is more probably a tradition, but certainly that ancient, made these connections, connected the loop back up, which gave them the initiative to create this city of God.
Very interesting. And so, let's say if we follow through on the timeline there, then and end up back in the United States again, then look at Washington D.C. as being the new Zion. Then, in that sense,
yes.
Do you see now currently, from your perspective, that this is that failing? I mean, in one regard, it's being under. In one, I mean, it's difficult because it's militarily, it's one of it is the strongest force in the world, and but at the same time, as a nation, the United States, that this great Masonic experiment is kind of crumbling in terms of economy and other situations as well. What do you think is happening over there? Its great achievement was to which was something that was started in Europe but continued over there, was to give freedom of science and to give science the permission to operate outside of theology. So it gave democracy and freedom of science. Those were the two important things. Now we see democracy
disappearing over the hill in Europe because we're heading to a non-democratic Europe.
Yeah.
In the United States and in Europe, we're seeing financial strains which look near terminal for the euro, and in the United States, we're seeing that we could be just weeks away from bankruptcy.
That's right.
Which would potentially, I mean, there are always ways to wriggle out of these things, but potentially would see a complete meltdown of the whole capitalist banking commerce system. So to that extent, it might be failing, or at least struggling in the extreme, because, well, there's two answers. One is because they're apparently working on the assumption that if they do everything according to the old rule book, they'll win because God will be on their side. Well, it doesn't work like that. But the way out of all this just might be for somebody seriously to listen to what the evidence that Alan and I have produced and apply that patterning to DNA and see if we've got a message, because the message might be, hi guys, by now you'd be really, really struggling. But let me tell you, I thought that would happen, and here's what you do next. Now, wouldn't that be nice?
You mean a
recontact from God?
A recontact, okay. And how
through the message,
right? And obviously that would entail us to only being able to read this message as we've attained a certain, I guess, level of technology and scientific knowledge,
yes,
right?
Yeah. We have to be here to do it. But of course, if it is God or whoever the entity, the wisdom behind it is, would know we are due to be here, and we are here. So now's we are agents of our own destruction if we're not guided. And now it's the time for the second phase, when and this is obviously highly theoretical and speculative.
Sure.
When God says, you've had tens of thousands of years, or even millions and billions of years, where you had to make your own way. Now we can work together, but you had to get here first. And God forms not a faith relationship with mankind, but an actual interface with mankind, or at least tells us how to read chapter 2.
Interesting. So, yeah, it's like a dual idea, when I listen to some of this, because in one way I can see that it's because we have listened to this, entity or God, whatever it is, that we potentially have ended up in the situation we are. At the same time, I understand that that's man's own interpretation of God's word and actually not the actual one. This is, yes, one of the problematic situations here. I mean,
one of the big problems has theology gets in the way of spirituality.
That's right.
But God is the ultimate spirituality. He's not a Muslim necessarily, and he's not a Christian necessarily. He's not Hindu or Buddhist. He's God, or she's God. And yet all of those relationships are potentially valuable, but it's the politics that happens inside these institutions that get in the way.
And then at the same time, I went back to what you alluded to earlier in terms of, you refer to corrupt kings basically rising to the top in Egypt, and I can't help to think that we're in a similar situation here. Just because these people are executing a plan, it doesn't mean that their motives are good. They might have gotten access to some of this from our point of view, or at least from mine and other people's occult knowledge, and now manage to actually steer society because of it, because no one else has a clue of what the hell is going on, pretty much, right?
Well, we're told that both Adolf Hitler and Winston Churchill both used occult means to plan their wars.
That's right.
So it's not impossible that's the case in other places too, in the modern current period. Humans have got failings, and I think one of the problems is when anyone becomes convinced that they have the answer, rather than have the right questions to ask.
That's right. I couldn't agree more. I think that it's a good place, Christopher, to begin to round things up for this time. And I have immensely enjoyed talking with you, and then earlier, of course, with Alan as well. This has been really, really fascinating for me, and I hope that we can at some point do it again. But in the meantime here, let's talk a little bit about your books here as well, then, so people know where to basically get some more information about this. I myself, very hungry to obviously read the latest book before the pyramids. So would you relay people to maybe Amazon or other bookshops for a copy of that then? Or
Yeah, it's available in quite a number of places. Standard bookshops are changing things these days, but Amazon for sure, obviously, is always there. But we're just interested to must get a website going to get feedback and help, because there's two of us trying to think our way out of this, and we've had feedback from some very, very significant people. Before the pyramids, we were contacted, for one example, one guy who's a professor of kinetics. He's got a PhD in chemistry from Oxford and one in physics from Saskatchewan. And he said the trouble with most physicists is they don't understand chemistry, and the problems with most chemists is they don't understand physics. And he's also a brilliant archaeologist, because for the last 30 years he's been working away with the most thorough science on archaeology, which you can't trust archaeologists to do because they're not very scientific, most of them. We're producing stunning results. And we're very proud to say, he said, you've got all this right. This is a major breakthrough, absolutely major breakthrough. This is a major breakthrough. This is a major, So we just need more people with open minds. We've tried to approach archaeologists several times, and they either say, well, sorry, my maths isn't up to it, I can't understand. Well, you should learn maths then if you want to be an archaeologist.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not about digging up bones and gluing pots together. There's a lot more to it than that these days.
That's right.
Or else they say, you're just lunatic fringe. Well, okay, sorry, could you tell us where it's wrong? No, I don't know, but you will be. Don't
bother me with the evidence. My mind is made up.
That's exactly the problem, yeah.
So Civilisation One is the other book we talked about, and also Who Built the Moon as well. And then, of course, you have the series. How many books is it in total now on the Hiram Key theme, Chris?
Well,
4, 5?
No, about 8, I think.
8?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
There was the Hiram Key was followed by the Second Messiah, followed by Uriel's Machine. Those 3 were all massive international sellers. Then Civilisation One, and Who Built the Moon. Then Hiram Key Revisited, going back, looking at it. And then Before the Pyramids. And we're trying to work on a book at the minute, but it's just too intimidating because it's dealing with some of this heavy stuff I've been mentioning.
It's taking you in a new area in that sense. And are you, your plan up next, if I ask you about that, is that to obviously continue the work, but are you going to put more into book form maybe and elaborate further with Alan some of these ideas and try to get closer to some of the answers in terms of
That's
both?
what we're trying to do, but it's getting increasingly emotionally as well as intellectually draining because of the enormity of the issues involved. But it's so delightfully simple and so checkable. I mean, the Washington, D.C. thing, anyone can go on Google Earth and check it out.
That's right.
It's just that easy, which must be a curse for the people that don't want it to be spotted.
Well, they've been vehemently trying to deny it, obviously. It's nothing to that, despite that David Overson and some of these other people as well have really, really detailed how Pierre L'Enfant and some of the other, people that are involved, what their intentions was pretty much.
Well, there's absolutely no doubt that Overson got those things right, but it's the measurement systems that and the placing of all those things within that takes it onto another level.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, I've looked at Philadelphia, which is obviously the capital before Washington, D.C., Paris, London, Berlin, wherever you want to name. I've just looked at lots and lots of cities to see if there is anything that checks out, which would either demonstrate that they were doing it in more places or that the whole thing's a coincidence and these things do happen. And it's just a mistake on my part and Alan's part. But no, there's only the one place on the planet where all these things happen, and that's Washington, D.C. So there's no doubt about it. And unfortunately, the publishers, PR people in the States were just useless
really?
at getting the message into the media.
Yeah.
But had they done so, it would have had the Dan Brown effect.
Well, that's right. I think they pick and choose. Unfortunately, if you know what I mean, to put certain people on the bestseller list, and then consequently it becomes the bestseller. If you know what I mean. So
yeah, I'd love to know who's funding Dan Brown.
Yeah,
originally, I mean, obviously
right.
it's self-perpetuating now, but in the first instance, because he came from nowhere. Who was he? Very invisible.
Yeah.
Writing dreadfully, some might say. With very simplistic plots that were just a sort of caricature of the truth. And his latest one is just so accurate in the broad shape of its truths, because that's what we talk about in Before the Pyramids.
Yeah.
I mean, the first half of the book is very different Before the Pyramids. The second half, because it was halfway through writing it that we came across this strange thing, because I found a henge in Washington, D.C., I was appearing on a program about the Founding Fathers, and I was wanted to see something in Washington, D.C., and I just noticed this big circular thing. Oh, it's a henge, which obviously it can't be. And it was actually built by the U.S. Navy in the 1800s, and it was a henge because it was like the building 6,000 years ago. It was for measuring movements of stars, so that the U.S. Navy could make its charts and time the stars, and they needed exactly the same thing for the same purpose. Things don't change. But the really odd thing was that it was built to megalithic dimensions, which then caused me to look at Washington, D.C. in general, and it was like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, that must have been an eye-opener, yeah.
I mean, it was just, the more we looked, the more and there were no exceptions.
Yeah. Planned cities, obviously, as well from the start, and I think that's what's so interesting with the American experiment, if you will, that they had a chance, if you will, to really do it from scratch. And many of these European cities are built on older parts of the city where this knowledge, maybe at least not in the beginning, was as prominent. But here you had a situation where Masons from day one could handle the whole construction, you know.
But Christopher Wren, who was Grand Master of Freemasonry in England, designed St Paul's Cathedral famously, but he also designed London, which was it was not built. A lot of his churches were built, but he had a grand design for London. But even his grand design didn't fit, so he wasn't in the know. His design wasn't built, but even the design he made wasn't of the same order at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, Paris was pretty well laid out, and there are parts of other great cities that were happening at similar times, but nothing. Only Washington, D.C.
Very, very interesting. We'll have to read more about it, obviously, Christopher, and thank you very much for your time here today. Keep
Pleasure.
up the great work, keep philosophizing, and I hope we can do this again at some point as well. It was lovely talking to you.
Okay, Henrik. Thanks a lot.
We'll be back with more for you in just a few days. In the meantime, of course, keep an eye on the website for all the latest developments. My thanks to Fredrik, Lana, and Elizabeth at Red Ice. A special thanks, as always, to you for subscribing and for showing your support of our efforts. We couldn't do this without you. Have a great day. We'll talk more soon. Bye-bye.